Dyslexia: Strengths, Weaknesses, and Treatments by Lee Randolph. Narrated by J.A. Leidig. Chapter 1. What is dyslexia? Those who struggle with dyslexia might have experienced some teasing, exemption from class, ridicule, or the disappointment of really trying to understand reading when they're just much more practical than literate. Dyslexia, like any kind of other condition, can range from exceptionally present to partially deviant. What I mean by that is that two people may be identified as being dyslexic, yet one might have a tougher time reading than the other. Maybe the first one just blends a few letters, while the second scrambles each letter of the whole alphabet with the others, being left completely puzzled. So when we address the topic of being dyslectic, it does not always come in the same form. There are those that are simply a more severe, less changeable case than others. Some might discover it fast, while others will struggle all their lives. Those who are dyslectic aren't stuck to a faulty mind, but just a deviant one. And cognitive skills can be dominantly present in their brain, more than a few other who don't experience dyslexia. That's the first misconception I need to clarify. Dyslexia is specified as a disorder that entails trouble in learning how to read or analyze words, letters, and other symbols, but that doesn't influence their general intelligence. Chapter 2. What are the effects? I am shocked that some people don't want to know that their children have dyslexia. I compare it to mold in a house. If you don't see it, and if you do not do an inspection to seek it, you will never ever see it's there, right? No, wrong. At some point you will notice it, but because all that time you didn't want to know about it, the mold grew bigger until perhaps the whole floor covering, ceiling, or wall surface needed to be taken out because it began spreading. And the same is very true for dyslexia. I have heard people say that dyslexia does not really exist, and also that every determined child can learn how to read just as quick as any other. This is quite controversial, just because even though most children with dyslexia learn how to read, they also achieve this objective with more initiative on their part and much more difficulties. Hey, I understand. Not everyone wants to assume that there is something kind of wrong with their child. Not everybody actually wants to be confronted with reality and see it. But those who choose to do so can get help. And as a result of that, they can have a chance to turn their weaknesses around. If you don't recognize the condition, you won't adjust your learning program, your reading speed, your tasks, and so a lot more won't be according to the degree and demands of the kid. Consequently, it is crucial that these things are noticed, and that if a kid has dyslexia, he or she will be dealt with accordingly. I know a person who has dyslexia, and the majority of times, what she does is just guess the word, based on whether or not she has seen them earlier. She sees several letters and then fills out the gaps as opposed to being able to read each letter independently and make sense out of the spelling of the word. Not that English spelling makes any sense, but hey, that's another discussion. So when a never-before-seen word is shown, it's even harder for that person because she's required to read each letter. Reading words isn't a natural process. It does not come intuitively. It's a pattern that must be learned and practiced over and over again until the skill has been adequately practiced, that it ends up being more automated. How reading is taught matters because it affects the way the child learns, and therefore at which speed. It is never really too late to recognize somebody with dyslexia. Some children become identified in the first or second year of school, others in the third year of school, and there are even those who do not notice it till the adult years. Sometimes that's just because they have a lighter version on the less severe side of the spectrum. Other times, it's because of ignorance from educators or mothers and fathers. Some evident indicators could be clearly that a child keeps confusing the D and the B, or the P and the Q. This actually happens to all kids initially, yet to a person who has dyslexia, it keeps being the case again and again. Chapter 3. Where does dyslexia originate from? Dyslexia has sometimes been called word sightlessness. It is more difficult for them to see what words say. But scientists and educators are always astonished at the fact that those that had dyslexia were never blind in any other way. As a matter of fact, some of them had far better eyesight than the ones who really did not have dyslexia. I may have briefly pointed out in that dyslexia often runs in the family. So the genetic beginning of it is influencing the afferent neurons, and consequently, the deviances in the mind can't be overlooked. I know a family in which a lot of the kids and one of the parents have dyslexia. This is no coincidence, especially since they have lots of children, which makes my reasoning that much more valid. And that is not the only one. Specialists and educators have often reported the same problems in learning when they saw brothers or sisters from the same household. In the mid-19th century in Germany, they did some research on the issue and reached the conclusion that there's something like dyslexia, despite a person's knowledge, psychological well-being, or eyesight. Search for the sentence, "Are more boys than girls dyslexic?" and you will find urban legends bound with lecturing, not psychology or actual neurology studies. To state that young boys' minds and girls' brains of dyslexics work in a comparable route is complete nonsense. This info is expected to help guardians, therapists, and teachers push towards diagnosing and dealing with formative dyslexia with a clearer understanding of what we know today. More boys are dyslexic. Sure, some young guys are dyslexic. What's more, it could have some sort of impact on both evaluation and treatment, so we can take that into account. We have to end the urban myth. The whole question, with respect to whether more young men than young ladies are dyslectic, has been addressed. The real problem is that when you Google, "Are more boys than girls dyslexic?" the primary locations that presumably show up show an unreliable answer to this question. A University in Michigan Dyslexia Help website came to this conclusion. Although it is used to be assumed that more boys experience dyslexia than girls, today's research has suggested that dyslexia occurs in around the same proportions. One possible clarification of this myth is that boys might be more likely to act out when experiencing reading problems, while girls may try to hide their problem. For that reason, more boys would be acknowledged and diagnosed with dyslexia, falsely pumping up the stats. Wrong, awfully wrong. Sites like these sustain the myth. An engaging 1990 investigation by Shaywitz and others in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that dyslexia just seemed to be significantly more prevalent in boys due to school-recognizable proof systems. Dr. Sally Shaywitz kept pushing the recommendation disposition idea, suggesting that there was no significant distinction in the prevalence of the dyslexic handicap in boys and young ladies in her broadly promoted book, Overcoming Dyslexia, from 2003. The science isn't completely wrong. Dyslexia is 2 to 3 times more common in young boys and guys. Be that as it may, in 2004, there was a little setback in the scientific research. In a much less known yet incredibly relevant investigation in 2004, Ritter and his affiliates found that dyslexia was several times more prevalent in young boys than in girls. Of equivalent significance is the finding that school-identifiable proof of dyslexia is, to a higher degree, very poor. In their 2013 assessment, Quinn and others reported the following anecdotes. Probably the most surprising and most uncomfortable conclusion from the research was how few pupils that met research-based standards for reading impairments were recognized as handicapped by their educators. Less than 20% of students we noticed as really meeting a functional interpretation of a reading problem were also identified as learning impaired by their teachers. Today, most teachers and countless therapists stay ignorant. Boys' and young girls' brains are most definitely not the same. This has been validated by Dr. Guinevere Eden, a professor of pediatric medicine at Georgetown University Medical Center, who is doing intriguing mind imaging anatomical investigations to find the appropriate reactions. She suggests substantial contrasts in the cerebrum structure of young boys and young girls. Minds of female dyslexics differ from women non-dyslexics in some ways which do not mirror the differences they saw in young boys with and without dyslexia. One could really wonder what this is for. Has nature, evolution, or God been dealing out the special needs in an unjust way? Think of it this way. We discussed that dyslexia is usually not just a lack of ability to get reading as quickly as others, yet a lot of times it comes with abilities and characteristics that exceed those of others, like imaginative, technological, spatial, building, developing, electronic devices, computers, inventing new things, and scientific research. Isn't it fascinating to see that young boys in particular, who typically end up being husbands and dads, and consequently most of the time the main providers, have abilities to pay for those bills? They are the ones filling the voids in society in fields like construction, developing technology, and certain technical work. I have seldom seen an inspector, construction worker, or technician that was a woman. It's possible, yet it's less typical, and this could be one of the reasons. It is pretty similar to the valid question some may ask, why is the risk for a young boy to be autistic 5 times higher, according to research, compared to little girls? Do not misunderstand me. Autism is something completely different than dyslexia, and the two should not actually be mentioned in the exact same sentence unless an individual happens to have both. But a comparable response clarifies this problem. Does it not make sense for the ones with autism, who typically become actively focused on one topic, stuck in their own small world, and more interested in objects and procedures than in people and human connections, to be the ones who head out there building factories, dealing with electrical power lines, erecting huge buildings, learning about computer data, and doing all kinds of tasks that require a particular feeling of loneliness they would not care about? In other words, somebody that would be too social, caring, and good with relationships could get bored, depressed, or frustrated doing these tiresome or extremely technical work, but someone with autism would not. Personally, I'm happy that not every person has an interest in or is great at the exact same things. There are so many work opportunities that call for better practical skills than just reading or writing. If every person would be great at the same things, everyone would do the same job. In a way, we should be thanking God, nature, or evolution, whichever you believe in, for the fact that some people in our culture have a deviant mind and are, consequently, more inclined to and curious about, and maybe have more skills for, to do those activities that need other abilities. Chapter 4. Signs of Dyslexia. Here are some of the signs that may help detect that a kid has dyslexia, whether that is an extreme or a light form. In a nutshell, appears as wise, highly intelligent, and being able to articulate well, yet not very skilled to read, write, or spell at the right grade level. In some cases, seen as careless, silly, nonchalant, or just not trying hard enough. Is not a serious case, so the institution will not help him or her. Has a high IQ level, but flunks a lot of exams. Oral exams go well, yet written ones don't. The kid feels inadequate and might have lower self-worth, hides or tries to forget about errors with brilliant social strategies or justifications, could get quickly disappointed or upset about school reading or exams, has a ton of talent when it involves art, acting, music, sporting activities, technical projects, storytelling, marketing, business skills, design, building, or engineering. Spaces out occasionally and gets a lot more easily sidetracked or forgets about the time. Has a hard time focusing, seems hyperactive, or a daydreamer. The very best learning experiences are much more practical by nature, via hands-on experiences, demos, trial and error, observing how things work, and visual aids. Seeing sentence structures, reading and being able to spell are hard. May grumble about dizziness, headaches, or stomach pains while he or she is reading. Confused by letters, numbers, words, series, or verbal explanations. Their reading or writing shows repetitions, things being added, transpositions, omissions, replacements, and turnarounds in letters, numbers, and/or words. Shows that she or he sees non-existent motion while reading, writing something, or copying the writings of another. It appears as if he or she has vision problems, yet when they do an eye test, absolutely nothing is wrong with their eyes. Exceptionally well-sighted and watchful, or lacks the right depth, comprehension, and peripheral vision. Usually reads something and rereads something without recognizing much of what's being read. Spells phonetically and inconsistently. Hearing and speech. Has expanded hearing. The child might listen to some things not stated or noticeable to others. May be distracted by noises more frequently. Has a difficult time expressing ideas with words. Speaks in halting phrases. Does not always finish her or his sentences. May stutter when under stress. Mispronounces longer words or transposes expressions, words, and syllables when he or she says something. Writing and motor skills. Problems with writing or copying. Pencil grip is uncommon. Handwriting varies or is illegible. Awkward, unskillful, poor at ball or team sports. Difficulties with fine and/or gross motor skills and certain related tasks. Prone to motion sickness. Can be ambidextrous and often mixes up left and right, over and under. Mathematics and time management. Not very good at telling or keeping track of time, learning more from sequenced information or tasks, or getting on time. Computing math shows dependence on finger counting and other tricks. Knows responses but cannot show it by writing it down. Can count but has a hard time managing cash or doing the math. Can do arithmetic but falls short for word troubles. Has a difficult time comprehending algebra or advanced math. Memory and cognition. Great long-term memory when it concerns events, locations, and other people's faces. Bad memory when dealing with collections or facts of information that hasn't been experienced in real life. Thinks primarily in pictures and feelings, not so much in sounds and words. The interior dialogue is more limited than that of others. Behavior, wellness, advancement, and character. Either chaotic and unorganized or compulsively orderly, neat freak. Maybe the funny kid, troublemaker, or too silent. Has had typical very early or late developing phases, talking, crawling, walking, tying shoes. prone to ear infections, may be sensitive to foods, additives, and chemical or processed food, can be an extra deep or light sleeper, bedwetting beyond suitable age, abnormally high or low tolerance to physical discomfort, strong sense of justice, emotionally sensitive, intends to do everything perfectly. Errors and symptoms increase substantially with being confused, time pressure, psychological anxiety, or being in bad shape or being unwell. Chapter 5. The 9 Strengths of Dyslexia. 1. Seeing the big scheme of things. The people with dyslexia usually see things more holistically. They miss the trees, but see the forest. 2. Finding the awkward one out. Those with dyslexia stand out at international visual processing and the detection of impossible figures. Dyslectic scientist Christopher Tonkin described his uncommon sensitivity to things out of place. Researchers in his profession must understand huge amounts of visual information and precisely find black hole abnormalities. There are so many people with dyslexia in the field of astrophysics that it triggered research at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. Findings verified that those with dyslexia are better at recognizing and remembering intricate images. 3. Improved pattern recognition. Those with dyslexia have the capability to see how things connect to form complicated systems, and to determine resemblances amongst multiple things. Such strengths are very likely to be of particular significance for fields like science and mathematics, where visual representations are essential. 4. Good spatial knowledge. Many individuals with dyslexia demonstrate better skills at manipulating 3D items in their mind. Tons of the world's top architects and designers have dyslexia. 5. Image thinkers. The people with dyslexia tend to think in photos instead of words. Research at the University of California has demonstrated children with dyslexia have improved image recognition memory. 19th century French carver Auguste Rodin could look at paintings in museums by day and paint them from memory at night. His dyslexia meant he could barely read or write by the age of 14, with his reading skills developing much later. 6. Sharper peripheral vision. The people with dyslexia have a better peripheral vision than most, suggesting that they can rapidly take in an entire scene. Even though it can be hard to focus in on individual words, dyslexia appears to make it easier to see outer edges. James Howard Jr., a teacher of psychology at the Catholic University of America, described in the journal Neuropsychologia in an experiment in which individuals were asked to select the letter T from a sea of letter L's drifting on a computer screen. Those with dyslexia recognized the letter more quickly. 7. Business entrepreneurs. Did you know that 1 in 3 American business owners have dyslexia? Business owners like Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, and Charles Schwab were all dyslexic. Perhaps better strategic and creativity could supply a real business advantage. 8. Highly creative. Tons of the world's most creative stars have dyslexia, like Johnny Depp, Keira Knightley, and Orlando Blossom. 9. Thinking outside the box. Problem solving. Those with dyslexia are well known for having sudden leaps of insight that solve problems with an unconventional technique. This is an instinctive technique to problem solving that can seem like daydreaming. Staring out of the window is how dyslexics work, letting their brain slide into neutral and reduce itself around an issue to let connections assemble. The psychological function that triggers dyslexia is a present in the truest sense of the word, a natural ability, a skill. It is something unique that boosts the person. Dyslexics don't all develop the exact same gifts, but they do have certain psychological functions in common. Here are the fundamental abilities all dyslexics share. They can utilize the brain's capability to change and produce understandings, the primary ability. They are highly aware of the environment. They are more curious than average. They think generally in photos rather than words. They are highly instinctive and informative. They think and view multidimensionally, using all of the senses. They can experience thought as reality. They have vivid creativities. These 8 basic abilities, if not suppressed, revoked or destroyed by parents or the educational process, will result in 2 characteristics: higher than regular intelligence and remarkable creative abilities. From these, the true gift of dyslexia can emerge, the gift of proficiency. Chapter 6: Math and Dyslexia. Mathematics is a fascinating topic in that it requires conceptual, logical, and spatial thinking, all areas in which the dyslexic, right-brain thinker excels. Mathematics also needs neatness, exactness, and efficient calculation skills, parts in which the dyslexic, right-brain thinker battles. Conceptually, these children comprehend mathematics, which is an advantage. One of the hallmark signs of dyslexia is an above-average intelligence, with an accompanying and perplexing struggle to learn certain subjects. Rote memorization of mathematics facts is just one of these areas. I have good news. Just as with mastering reading, our children can master their mathematics facts by using their highly visual brains and using some creative approaches tailored for their unique style of learning. They can also learn how to organize their thinking and their written work so that longer computations do not become half-day marathons of tears and frustration. Teaching mathematic concepts. Adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, fractions, and decimals. Those mathematical ideas need a certain amount of mature reasoning to understand. When teaching a kindergartner to comprehend the concept of numbers, we start by linking the concept to something real, as he begins to learn to count by touching and manipulating objects. The idea of numbers, their symbols, and their meaning be clear or concrete. So with the older kid, getting their hands on objects so they can understand mathematics principles is critical. Hands-on learning helps students comprehend the why behind mathematic principles. One of the best curricula for teaching math to a younger dyslexic, visual students is Math UC. From including and subtracting to fractions and decimals, the program comes with manipulatives that highlight the idea being learned. By building the problem with the manipulatives, saying the equation, and after that writing the problem, the student is using 3 modes of learning: kinesthetic, auditory, and visual. The method in our home has always been that the kid builds the issue with the manipulatives whenever till the principle becomes clear. When the concept is clear, the manipulatives are no longer needed. This takes longer for some kids than others. No big deal. It is how they learn. Learning mathematic facts with dyslexia. This leads me to the question you all have been waiting on: how to get those math facts to stick. All of us remember those timed mathematic fact tests with a sheet of small mathematic problems that we were to solve them as quick as we could, proving our level of mastery. Torture for a dyslexic student. Why? since the dyslexic brain struggles with low working memory. If you have taught a dyslexic kid for any length of time, you know what I'm talking about. You teach the idea one day. They seem to have a pretty good handle on it. You revisit the same concept the next day, and it is as though you are teaching it for the first time. What? How can you not remember? We have been over this. Place some exaggeratedly a great deal here. Times. Rote memorization is not a strength of the dyslexic mind. So how do we help them master their math facts? Make use of visual strengths. Use manipulatives, even daily products or a packaged curriculum like Mathematics UC, and get your children touching and experiencing math. Let your children see the patterns of skip countings by 2s, 5s, 10s, by building with math blocks or shading a 100s chart. Let them touch and experience math concepts. Once they understand the why, the rest will fall into place. A fast online search will yield tons of hands-on math ideas. Another visual method is using images for recalling math facts. City Creek items are visually based and offer times tables and addition programs using images, stories, and songs perfect for the highly visual student. Use music or tunes. All of my junior high school and high school students have developed settlement abilities for being able to access math facts throughout longer calculations. One of the approaches they used was one that they learned in first and second grades: skip counting. They at first learned these by listening to a really adorable skip counting CD put out by Math UC. Though they have mastered most of their facts by 8th grade, long division will push them. They can always access that auditory memory of skip counting to find an answer. Chapter 7. Treatments and Medications. What is it really like when you have both ADHD and dyslexia? ADHD and dyslexia can coexist. While one disorder does not trigger the other, people who have one typically have both. According to the Centers for Illness Control and Prevention, the CDC, almost 50% of the trusted source of children detected with ADHD also have a learning disorder, like dyslexia. In fact, their symptoms at times can be comparable, making it hard to find out what's causing the behavior you're seeing. According to the International Dyslexia Association, ADHD and dyslexia can both trigger people to be dysfluent readers. They neglect parts of what they read. They burn out, annoyed, and sidetracked when they try to read. They might even act out or refuse to read. ADHD and dyslexia both make it tough for people to understand what they have read, despite the fact that they are rather smart and usually extremely verbal. When they write, their handwriting might be sloppy, and there are often issues with spelling. All of this can mean they struggle to live up to their scholastic or professional potential, and that in some cases leads to anxiety, lower self-confidence, and depression. But while symptoms of ADHD and dyslexia overlap, the two conditions are different. They're detected and treated in a different way, so it's important to comprehend every one independently. Chapter 8. Learning Disabilities in the Courtrooms, School, and Society. We have summarized the current modern scientific views on particular reading specials needs, dyslexia. Those views, and also the reality that underlies reading handicap, are rather intricate. The threat with these explanations is that they can multiply endlessly. We can keep finding one turtle underneath another. All these advanced scientific results and analysis are practically beneficial only to the level that they enable us to answer three major questions. 1. Do we know why reading impairment develops? 2. Do we know what the course of reading disability is? And 3. Do we know how to treat reading handicap? At this moment, we don't have definite answers to these questions. We do know enough, however, to help people who are at risk for or who have a reading handicap to become better readers. As complex and unresolved as some of our questions about dyslexia are, clinical research has been of remarkable practical importance. We can now demonstrate how the clinical knowledge built up over the last decade of extensive research on reading impairment has shaped, in a few cases, and could form in many more cases, the preventative and remedial programs offered to children with dyslexia. The majority of the results presented in the before were gotten through research programs supported by the National Institute of Kid Health and Person Development, NICHD. The NICHD started its program on learning special needs in 1965, and ever since it has funded the research of over 100 scientists in medication, psychology, and education. All of those researchers have worked to further our comprehension of the nature and course of learning disabilities. As a big percentage, about 80%, of learning special needs involved reading problems, many NICHD research studies have concentrated on dyslexia. Besides accumulating scientific knowledge about dyslexia, one of the main agendas of the NICHD-funded research was to develop a set of interference techniques that would link the frontiers of scientific knowledge to the practical needs of kids and grown-ups with dyslexia. Much needs to change. The most popular monolith in Highgate Cemetery in London is that of Karl Marx. The words inscribed on it are popular. Theorists have only analyzed the world. The point, though, is to change it. There is a desperate need for change in the way we teach reading in both regular and customized classrooms. The whole system is in crisis. First, the varieties of children with inadequate reading skills and those determined as having reading special needs are rising. Second, there are inadequate numbers of special education instructors, and their training has been and remains very costly. Third, students in regular classrooms have such a large range of abilities that the teachers need to be equipped to teach at least 3 or 4 different grade levels at the same time. Fourth, tons of parents have turned to acquiring costly additional materials and private instruction in reading to enhance what's done in school. Fifth, the school systems have been challenged by numerous suits accusing them of failing to provide proper educational programs. Starting in the 1980s, we have made great advances in discovering what's important for success in reading and how those who are at risk for failure can be helped to succeed. As always, science has been sluggish to filter into daily practice. At this moment, we will review significant conclusions drawn from the NICHD-supported intervention research studies and consider the implications clinical discoveries have for teacher preparation programs and parental practices. Let us start with an improved definition of dyslexia based on recent research discoveries in the field and developed by a collaborative group of scientists, specialists, and supporters from the National Center for Learning Disabilities and the Orton Dyslexia Society. Numerous of the ideas embedded in standard descriptions of dyslexia are important for the following conversation. First and foremost, as has been stated, the core indications of dyslexia are difficulties in decoding and evaluating phonemes within words. Second, the problems the ones with dyslexia have are pretty specific. Those with dyslexia walk typically, talk generally, and comprehend oral language generally, yet they have issues processing written signs. Third, reading problems often accompany writing and spelling problems. Finally, dyslexia is presumed to be of constitutional origin. That is, it has a natural foundation. We will go back to these crucial things later. Now, though, we begin with the last problem, which has significant ramifications for education. This is the problem to which we keep returning. If dyslexia is in part biological, is there any hope for remediation? The answer to this question is both simple and certain. Yes. Educational intervention is now the only hope of readers with dyslexia. Moreover, if sufficient help is not offered, their reading deficit will only remain or get worse. In a sense, even though this analogy is somewhat extreme, denying a reader with dyslexia correct instruction is like leaving a child with a high fever outside in the cold, rather than putting that kid into a warm bed. How do we know that it is possible to compensate for the natural liabilities of readers with reading disabilities? To our knowledge, there has not been a single research study that measures the degree of natural impairment in the ones with dyslexia and that concurrently gauges how much remediation is needed to achieve grade-matched reading requirements. Additionally, research studies examining some different behavioral qualities show that payment for an individual's natural deficits is possible. The following research study highlights the possibility of such compensation. Finnish researchers studied the relationship between flexible and non-modifiable factors influencing individuals' durability. This research study is just one of a lot that have tried to address the value of genetic history relative to the value of exercise and removal for the risk of developing a certain condition. At the research study's conclusion in 1994, there were 434 sets of twins in which one brother or sister had passed away of natural causes, usually heart disease or cancer, and the other had survived. In 173 of those 434 sets, the twins had worked out at different levels. Specifically, the researchers learned that periodic exercisers, those who took some but less than 6 brisk walks or jogs monthly, lasting about 30 minutes each, were 30% not as likely than their sedentary twins to have died. Energetic exercisers, those who took at least 6 vigorous walks or jogs monthly lasting about 30 minutes each, were 44% less likely to have died. In reaction to this study, Steve Farrell, an exercise physiologist and associate director of the Cooper Institute for Aerobics Research in Dallas, said, "Even if you have bad genes, this study highly suggests that increasing physical activity can definitely help you live longer." As this research study shows, biological doesn't mean etched in stone. On the contrary, biological, according to Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary, 7th edition, means pertaining to life and living procedures. If biological is about the living, then it is inherently about change. Living is never, ever static. It is always vibrant. Popular views concerning the hopelessness of surpassing anything that's natural are based on misconceptions. The biological foundations of dyslexia should be taken into account as one of the aspects adding to a specific outcome, a child's acquisition of reading skills. But the origins of dyslexia are complicated, possibly including academic environment and family reading traditions. Thus, the awareness that dyslexia has a partly natural basis must not anticipate remedial training. On the contrary, this realization needs to make it clear why such interference is needed. As Finnish researchers have revealed, people who form their activities and their environments to suit themselves rather than relaxing and waiting on their biological liabilities to overtake them tend to live longer. The exact same can be said of reading. The more correct guideline that's provided to the youngster while she or he learns to read, the more the child will read, and the not as likely it is that she or he will become a reader with an impairment. One of the most well-traveled pathways to poor reading is a biologically established early failure at reading, improved by ecologically enforced aggravation with reading. Simply put, early trouble with reading material causes slowed development of reading skills, and as a result, to avoidance of the practices of reading. At the pre-reading stage, the natural weakness of a poor reader is usually not seen, so the child is seen and treated by parents or caretakers and peers as no different from any other kid. Once the child starts to learn how to read, however, she or he rapidly begins to experience several failures. In contrast to his or her friends, this child finds reading a highly aggravating endeavor. What is more, the kid can advance quickly and quickly become as good as or better than the other children in tons of other domains: computer games, sports, drawing, and so on. So, whereas time spent with Nintendo's Dr. Mario is rewarding, the child can rescue the princess and triumphantly remove all the bad men along the way. Time spent with reading is unrewarding, unpleasant, and aggravating. Without appropriate direction offered in a timely manner, this kid could never read for enjoyment. It is unrealistic to overestimate the significance that structured, targeted, and effective reading practice, systematically offered at school and supported by parents or caretakers, plays in conquering this crescendo of disappointment. In lots of families, parents don't include their pre-literate kids in reading by reading together with them, showing them photos in a book, reading aloud to them, or motivating them to rhyme words that sound similar. That adult reaction is not unreasonable. After all, the thinking goes, this is the kind of thing schools are for. They will teach the child to read when the time comes. Even parents who have provided proper early reading experiences for their children with dyslexia often wonder if there is something else they could have done. When a kid doesn't master reading as well as her or his peers, even though the child's parents and school have provided an environment that has been adequate for the reading development of the kid's schoolmates, a lot of parents experience a high level of guilt. Statements such as, "I should have observed it earlier," "I should have been more concerned about it," and "I should have handled it better," suggest that parents or caretakers usually feel that they have failed to offer their kids with a good environment for reading development. Strangely enough, the discovery that the problem could have come from the child's miswired brain or with troublesome genes usually alleviates parental anxiety about failing to put a kid in the right reading environment. Some feeling of relief is not enough to fix the problem, however. What truly needs to be comprehended is that, in serious cases of reading disability, a normal environment for reading development is not enough. An extraordinary training effort might be required. Researchers are striving to determine whether some medical interference is possible, but our best choice at this moment depends on academic efforts. These academic efforts can be categorized into 3 categories. 1. Unique types of pre-reading and early reading direction and removal, when needed, performed by appropriately trained teachers. 2. A substantially greater amount and strength of mindful and accurate reading practice. Simply put, through computer-based exercises and reading practice. And 3, increased adult awareness of the ways in which they can help develop their children's pre-reading skills, motivate and stimulate the poor reader's practice of reading, and ensure the connection of the remedial effort. Thus, the most effective treatment is based on and involves 3 parts: the school, by providing specialized expert instruction in reading, the student's practiced reading, and the family's continuous support of the process. The coordinated effort of all 3 elements offers the most hope for success. In 1997, the NICHD released some sobering numbers attending to the efficiency of reading guidelines in the United States. According to the Institute's research-based estimates, about 40% of children in the United States encounter reading issues, for whatever reasons, extreme enough to hinder their enjoyment of reading. This figure needs to require immediate action. We believe that all 40% of these children can be helped. Does this mean that all of them should be clients of special education services? Absolutely not. If special services are offered to 0% of the population, they are no longer special and their quality could deteriorate quickly. That number shows that reading curricula as they now exist are not working adequately for a lot of children. Thus, the nation's whole system of reading education needs to be changed. That stunning statistic must be a wake-up call and should encourage us to restructure regular class teaching and retrain reading instructors. 25 years of reading disability research funded by the NICHD has recorded a lot of teaching and intervention techniques that can help produce the skills students really need to master reading. The problem, however, is communication of this information to teachers. According to the Orton Dyslexia Society, most teachers are not being given the content and depth of training needed to enable them to provide appropriate guidelines. Modifying current practice in instructor training will require a basic change in how reading guidelines commonly is seen. In contrast to the incorrect and harmful belief that little preparation is necessary to be able to teach reading, we really need to promote consciousness that literacy guideline is a complicated task. The expert demands of teaching reading must be acknowledged, and in turn, much improved training opportunities should be available to prepare instructors better for the tough job of teaching children to read. To meet the demands of across-the-country reading failure, the expert preparation of instructors should include 4 elements. First, it ought to include essential knowledge about the correspondence between written and spoken language and language structure. Second, preparation must include transference of knowledge concerning what standard skills are needed for children to master reading. Third, familiarity should be developed with leading methodologies of reading education, such as whole language and phonics approaches. Well-balanced views should change sweeping rejections of or rigid commitments to a particular approach. Ideally, instructors should use a well-balanced and informed approach based upon the instructional technique that will best address a given part of reading at a particular time. Fourth and finally, instruction must impart to teachers a standard knowledge about how to identify the types of reading problems that students are very likely to experience. These changes in instructor preparation will not be completely free, but they will be considerably less expensive than informing an increasing number of special education teachers to play catch-up to a continuously growing population of poor readers. While special education teachers will still be needed to teach the more severely impaired readers, a lot of poor readers can be taught successfully in the routine classroom. This has been Dyslexia: Strengths, Weaknesses, and Treatments by Lee Randolph. Narrated by J.A. Leidig. Dyslexia. Facts about dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia by Lee Randolph. Narrated by J.A. Leidig. Chapter 1. Why is dyslexia so hard and irritating? Nobody knows precisely how hard the dyslexic is trying. The frustration of kids with dyslexia often is fixated on their incapability to meet expectations. Their parents and teachers see a brilliant, enthusiastic kid who isn't learning how to read and write. Time and again, dyslexics and their parents hear, "He's such an intense kid. If only he would try harder." Paradoxically, no one knows exactly how hard the dyslexic is attempting. The pain of failing to meet other individuals' expectations is surpassed only by dyslexics' incapability to accomplish their objectives. That is especially true of those who develop perfectionistic expectations so as to deal with their anxiety. They grow up believing that it is awful to slip up. Nevertheless, their learning disability, practically by definition, means that these children will make a lot of negligent or silly errors. This is very frustrating to them, as it makes them feel chronically inadequate. The dyslectic often has issues with social relationships. Those can be traced back to causes. Dyslectic children might be physically and socially immature in comparison to their peers. This can result in a bad self-image and less peer approval. A dyslexic's social immaturity might make them uncomfortable in social circumstances. So many dyslexics have difficulty reading social hints. They could ignore the amount of personal distance needed in social interactions or be insensitive to other people's nonverbal communication. Dyslexia typically influences oral language functioning. Affected persons could have trouble finding the right words. They may stammer, or could stop briefly before addressing direct questions. This puts them at a disadvantage as they get into the teenage years, when language ends up being more crucial to their relationships with peers. My scientific observations led me to believe that just as dyslexics have trouble remembering the sequence of letter or words, they might also have trouble recalling the order of events. For example, let us look at a normal playground interaction between two children. A dyslectic child takes a toy that belongs to another kid, who calls the dyslexic a name. The dyslectic then hits the other child. In relating the experience, the dyslectic child could reverse the series of events. He may remember that the other child called him a name, and then he took the toy and hit the other kid. This presents two significant difficulties for the dyslectic kid. First, it takes him longer to learn a lot from his mistakes. Second, if an adult observed the events and asked the dyslectic child what occurred, the kid seems to be lying. Unfortunately, most interactions between kids include not 3 events, but 15 to 20. With his sequencing and memory issues, the dyslexic might relate a different series of events each time he tells the tale. Educators, parents, or caretakers, and psychologists conclude that he is either psychotic or a pathological phony. The inconsistencies of dyslexia produce serious difficulties in a kid's life. There is a tremendous irregularity in the student's individual abilities. Although everyone has strengths and weak points, the dyslexics are considerably overemphasized. Additionally, the dyslexic's strengths and weak points may be closely related. I once dealt with a young adult who got a best score on the graduate record exam in mathematics. He could do anything with numbers except remember them. The graduate student he tutored in sophisticated data or calculus had great trouble believing that he could not remember their phone number. These great variations produce a roller coaster influence for dyslexics. Sometimes they can accomplish tasks far beyond the abilities of their peers. At the next moment, they can be challenged with a job that they can't accomplish. Many dyslexics call this walking into great voids. To deal with these kinds of problems, dyslexics really need a thorough comprehension of their learning impairment. That will help them predict both success and failure. Dyslexics also perform erratically within tasks. That is, their errors are inconsistent. Here is an example. I once asked a dyslexic grown-up to write a 100-word essay on television violence. As one may expect, he misspelled the word television 5 times. Even so, he misspelled it a different way each time. This type of variation makes remediation more difficult. Finally, dyslexics' efficiency differs from day to day. On some days, reading could come fairly quickly, yet another day, they may be hardly able to write their own name. This disparity is very complicated, not only to the dyslexic, but also to others in his environment. Few other handicapping conditions are intermittent in nature. A kid in a wheelchair remains there. In fact, if on some days the child can walk, most specialists would consider it a hysterical condition. However, for the dyslexic, efficiency changes. This makes it extremely challenging for the individual to learn how to compensate because he or she can't anticipate the intensity of the signs on a given day. Chapter 2: Dyslexia and Dyscalculia. When listing recognized problems in kids, the term dyscalculia is often used after dyslexia. It sounds partially the same, but what exactly is the big difference between them? Where dys means not being able to, and lexia means reading. And for the other, calculia means computing. So it's not being able to count or calculate. Two of the most important subjects in school, language and arithmetic, are named after that way for kids who have problems with it. Yet so much more is well known about dyslexia, and dyscalculia is quite mysterious. Why is this the case? Real dyslexia is common partially as a result of the genetic element. It will always be likely to be passed on, in many cases, to the children, so a very big group remains represented in society. The attributes of dyslexia are now relatively clear. Reading with problems, having difficulty with the basics, horrible reading, and the numerous errors that can be made when spelling or writing. It appears that dyscalculia is a problem on a much smaller scale. The estimates vary from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 100. Then there is the much more challenging limit to determine what falls under poor computation and what falls under dyscalculia. To date, an acceptable answer has not yet been given. Scientists already make a distinction between lots of groups and certain forms, but in direct connection with dyslexia, the form that occurs most often seems to have the same cause. While those with dyslexia have difficulty with the alphabet, automating, recognizing the letters, having the ability to write the letters, things you must be able to read and be able to write before, people with dyscalculia have the same issues with the basics. What's 1? What is 2? What comes after 3? And how much is that then? 3? Kids with dyscalculia are unable to internalize the value of a number, just as children with dyslexia have trouble with internalizing the value of a letter. Chapter 3. What is dysgraphia? Dysgraphia is a learning disability that affects writing ability and fine motor skills. It hinders spelling, word spacing, and the general capability to put thoughts on paper, and makes the process of writing laboriously sluggish. Dysgraphia is a neurological disorder that can impact both children and adults. An approximated 20 to 60% of children with ADHD also have one or more learning impairments, like dysgraphia. When the act of forming letters needs so much effort that a kid forgets what he wanted to say in the first place, it's not unexpected that children with dysgraphia typically hate to write and resist doing so. Dysgraphia is generally recognized when a child learns to write, but it can stay hidden until their adult years, especially in mild cases. Those with dysgraphia periodically have a difficult time with other fine motor abilities, like tying their shoes, but not always. In elementary school settings, it's estimated that around 4% of kids experience dysgraphia. By middle school, when the intricacy of written tasks begins to increase dramatically, estimates can get as high as 20%. Dysgraphia symptoms: trouble forming letters or spacing words consistently, uncomfortable or agonizing grip on a pencil, difficulty following a line or staying within margins, trouble with syntax or following guidelines of grammar when writing, but not when speaking, trouble organizing or articulating thoughts on paper, noticeable difference between spoken and written comprehension of a topic. What are the different kinds of dysgraphia? Dysgraphia manifests in 3 general ways, every one requiring its own treatment plan. Dyslectic dysgraphia. In this form of dysgraphia, spontaneously written text, meaning writing that hasn't been traced or copied, is most strongly affected and is often illegible, especially as it goes on. Spelling, either oral or written, is extremely poor. Drawing and copying are not affected. Finger tapping speed, a frequently used procedure of fine motor skills, is in the normal variety. Motor dysgraphia. Motor dysgraphia most highly affects fine motor abilities, so finger tapping speed is highly irregular. All forms of writing, either spontaneous or copied, are close to illegible. Drawing and tracing abilities are far below par. Spelling skills are generally typical. Spatial dysgraphia. This kind of dysgraphia most highly influences the spatial relationship between the writing itself and the medium on which it's written. That means all forms of handwriting, and especially drawing, are highly troublesome. Still, finger tapping speed and spelling skills are close to normal. How are dysgraphia signs diagnosed? If you or your child have shown the symptoms noted above or other consistent issues with writing, typically but not always appearing by primary school, consult either the school special education staff or, when it comes to grown-ups, your primary care doctor, who can refer you to a dysgraphia expert. If your kid's school can't test for dysgraphia or does not want to, look for a physical therapist, pediatric neurologist, or a neuropsychologist with experience in the disorder. A professional can examine a patient's writing ability, fine motor skills, and, if appropriate, scholastic progress to figure out whether dysgraphia is the perpetrator. Tests for dysgraphia generally include a composing element, copying out sentences or answering quick essay questions, as well as fine motor part, in which you or your kid will be tested on reflexes and motor speed. The professional will try to get a sense of both the quality of the writing, how well do you or your child organize thoughts and convey ideas, and the physical act of writing itself, Does writing hurt? Are letters formed correctly? Why is dysgraphia medical diagnosis critical? The act of writing something down helps the majority of us to remember, organize, and process information. But children with dysgraphia who struggle with the mechanics of writing learn less from projects than do their peers. On top of that, when the physical act of writing is extremely challenging, a kid cannot successfully show what he knows. He might fail an exam just because he cannot translate his ideas and answers to paper. When a kid encounters such classroom defeat frequently, especially in the early years of schooling, it does not take long for scholastic frustration to turn into a sense of inferiority that weakens all efforts to learn. And that typically persists to adulthood if the dysgraphia isn't caught and dealt with. That is just one reason that early evaluation and analysis is so critical. Though a medical diagnosis can bring relief and progress at any age. How is dysgraphia treated? If your child is detected with dysgraphia, meet with the school's assessment team to request services or support. Lowering the focus on writing and/or the required daily amount of writing permits most children with dysgraphia to work effectively in school. Uninformed teachers have been known to tell students with dysgraphia to just practice by writing more often and focusing more intently on what they want to say. However, more practice is usually not what kids with dysgraphia needs to enhance their writing. Rather, they need the right practice, both at school and in the house. This often involves letter formation drills, fixing inaccurate grips on pencils or pens, and using handwriting-specific training programs like Handwriting Without Tears. Adults who dealt with undiagnosed dysgraphia for years have likely learned to stay away from writing as much as possible in their everyday life, a pursuit that gets easier every day in our significantly computer-based society. If writing is still a concern for you, though, you can request accommodations at work, like being allowed to type notes at the time of meetings or using speech-to-text technology. That can take the focus off handwriting and make everyday jobs easier to handle. Kids and adults alike may also benefit from dealing with a physical therapist on letter development, fine motor abilities, and cursive writing, which can be much easier than printing. Dysgraphia at a glance. Comorbidity with ADHD. An estimated 20 to 60% of kids with ADHD also have one or more learning impairments or language problems. Suggestive signs. Handwriting is sluggish and/or illegible. Irregular spacing or running out of space on the paper. Irregularly sized letters. Speaking the words out loud while writing. Left out words in sentences. Trouble with grammar and syntax structure. Avoidance of writing tasks. Trouble organizing thoughts when writing them down. Examination should be carried out by a school psychologist or special education expert. School supports might be provided by special education specialists and/or your child's class instructor. Chapter 4. Apes, Mice, Frogs, and Other Creatures with Dyslexia. Our brains and conduct distinguish us from other animals. The human brain is about 3 times as large as that of a primate of human size. Although chimps share most of our DNA, none of them can speak or read. Efforts to show that animals can talk, draw, write, or read are admirable for the amount of effort expended, but otherwise they have led mainly to dead ends. Author Samuel Butler, who was educated at the exact same institutions as Charles Darwin, the Shrewsbury School, and Cambridge University, but who turned out to be a committed anti-Darwinist, once said on an attempt to teach a dog indication language, "If I was his dog and he taught me, the first thing I should tell him is that he's a damned fool." Nobody has suggested that we teach apes how to read so that we can study typical and deficient reading. However, scientists have developed many animal models for studying dyslexia. This idea isn't crazy at all. The scientific reasoning behind these models is logical and relatively simple. As of today, we can state with certainty that dyslexia is related to changes in the brain, amongst which are 1. Structural anomalous variances in language areas, 2. Minor cortical malformation, and 3. Littler nerve cells, at least in the thalamus. Some of these features of dyslexic brains, particularly the appearance of cortical malformations, can be effectively modeled in animals. Animals might help us explore the first set of findings presented here, which are the significance of structural brain distinctions. For example, the anomaly in asymmetry and the cortical malformations for different qualities of animal learning. Later, what will be attended to is functional distinctions between brains of those with and without dyslexia. Animal research might help scientists investigate how small malformations resulting in interfered with metabolic profiles could result in visible and even consistent conditions of cognitive performance. Finally, studies of the changes in sizes and numbers of neurons and patterns of connection that can be considered as the basis for functional changes are possible in animal models only. Finding associations between animals' cortical malformations and their learning abilities is apt to prove useful in human research studies of dyslexia. There is absolutely nothing foolish in studying animal models of dyslexia so long as we set realistic objectives. When we reach the point at which we attempt to teach animals to read the New York Times, we probably will have passed the point of setting such goals. Do not be misinformed by what might seem like overwhelming proof that there's something certainly amiss with the brain of an individual with dyslexia. At this moment, scientists are inclined to believe that this is how it is, but so far no one can say for sure what's going on in dyslexia. All we can say is that the brains of people identified as having dyslexia typically appear to be different from the brains of people not so identified. The human brain is an interesting organ. It enters into the world with an excess of potential, a selection of possibilities so huge that lots will never be used. When an infant is born, her or his genes have created a big abundance of synapses linking the neurons, afferent neuron. There are way a lot of them, more than any person could ever really need. As the child develops, that number of synapses dwindles. The synapses that do not get used are just trashed. The connections between nerve cells are gotten rid of, so that the eye neurons themselves, having lost their links to the neuronal web, are essentially buried alive in the matter of the brain. That very extreme power of opportunity given to a baby's brain makes the dyslexia puzzle a lot more interesting. What fails so that the brain of an individual with dyslexia loses its chances for skilled reading? Might there be natural or other interventions yet unidentified that will supply or bring back these chances? Pasco Rackett, a neuroscientist at Yale University, compares the process of brain maturation to sculpture. You are constrained by the shapes and the size of the stone, but within that shapes and size, you can make infinite number of figures. Perhaps the day will come when we learn how to work with this stone to make the most of the brain's reading potential. Chapter 5. If I have trouble reading, will my kid also struggle? The first of these key questions concerns the degree to which relatives, who by definition have more genes in common than do non-relatives, resemble one another in experiencing reading issues. So many family studies of dyslexia have revealed higher than chance likelihood that other members will also have a reading disability. The exact possibility depends on the degree of relatedness. The likelihood is higher for identical twins than for siblings, higher for siblings than for cousins, etc. This possibility also depends on the seriousness of the reading issues experienced by the core family member studied, the specific meaning of reading issues used in the research study, and the source of info. With regard to source of information, the evident resemblance between skills of relatives is higher when the loved ones are assessed by scientists than when study participants report on their reading skills themselves. The fact that dyslexia runs in families, and that the reoccurrence risk for relatives of individuals with dyslexia is higher than it is for people picked at random, does not always mean that reading problems are hereditary. Many things run in families, example, lullabies, dishes, and jewelry. But not all of them have anything to do with DNA. For example, one may compute a reoccurrence risk for all daughters in a family for making impressive lasagna, considered that their mom, auntie, grandmother, and great-auntie all made great lasagnas. All these women used one family recipe passed from generation to generation. Only a very misguided researcher, though, would try to find a lasagna gene. But if the reason for dyslexia is simply environmental and determined by such factors as poor nutrition, lack of books in the home, lead contamination from a neighboring factory, or whatever, why is everyone in the Miller family not stricken by it? Researchers calculated the typical rate of reading problems among the parents or caretakers of kids with reading impairments right across 8 family research studies consisting of a total of 516 families. The typical value was 37%, with a series of 25 to 60%. Fathers tended to show a greater percentage of reading problems than did moms, 46% versus 33%. In other words, at least a quarter of the parents of kids with reading special needs were experiencing or had experienced reading issues themselves. In this analysis, scientists analyzed kids with reading disabilities, and after that, determined the probability that their parents or caretakers had similar issues. But comparable possibilities are found if we move in the other direction on the ancestral tree. Biological, or to put it simply, not adopted, kids of parents or caretakers with reading impairments are more likely to experience reading problems than are kids of typical readers. For instance, only about 5% of the children of parents or caretakers who are regular readers have reading disabilities. In contrast, about 36% of adults who had reading problems in their childhood report that at least one of their children has experienced some difficulties mastering reading. Similarly, a study of children with a couple of parents with dyslexia found that by the second grade, about 31% of these kids were identified by their schools as having reading special needs. The rate was 2 times as high, 62%, when these students were evaluated with precise mental tests. This last finding is noteworthy. Typically, when kids are evaluated through a battery of cognitive tests, the rate of reading-related issues is higher when the rate is determined by schools without such tests. How does one know that the tendency of reading disabilities to run in families isn't due mostly or wholly to environmental elements? Maybe parents or caretakers who do not read well bring up their kids in environments that don't supply much support for the children to learn how to read. On the one hand, the environment plainly does make a big difference. Kids raised to read will probably read better, on average, than kids not raised to read. Yet, within families that offer roughly the exact same reading environment for several children, some of the children show reading special needs and others do not. More than just environmental factors appear to be at work. Both genes and environment matter. Another body of evidence supporting the claim that dyslexia is a genetically affected condition originates from research studies that compare the various kinds of twins, specifically similar, monozygotic or MZ, and fraternal, dizygotic or DZ twins. The main premise here is that both kinds of twins share the same family environment, but that MZ twins vary considerably from DZ twins in hereditary similarity. Monozygotic twins develop from one egg fertilized by the same sperm, though dizygotic twins develop from two different egg-sperm couplings. MZ twins share all their genes, whereas DZ twins share on average only half of their genes. Thus, presuming that the environments of monozygotic and dizygotic twins are similar enough, researchers can measure the degree of similarity within twin sets, compare these degrees for similar and fraternal twins, and consequently approximate the effect of genes on a specific trait of interest. Here we describe two types of twin studies. 1. Concordance studies, which identify the degree to which the exact same characteristic appears in both members of a twin pair. And 2. Heritability studies, which determine to what degree the resemblance of traits in twins is explainable by genes or environments. In the first twin study of dyslexia, Knud Hermans learned that all 10 identical twin sets, 100%, were concordant, or in other words, comparable, demonstrating the same characteristic, for reading impairment, in contrast to only 11 of 33 fraternal sets, 33%. Simply put, all twins of the MZ twins with dyslexia also had dyslexia, though only 33% of the DZ twins with dyslexia had particular reading problems. Subsequent studies supported these findings. Generally, MZ twins revealed a higher degree of concordance, differing between 84% and 100%, though the concordance of DZ twins was substantially lower, varying between 20% and 55%. Therefore, unless there is something about being MZ twins, besides having similar hereditary makeups, that could cause the co-occurrence of reading failures in both twins, which is possible in theory, but no researchers have suggested what this something might be. These research studies all suggest that hereditary aspects are important in dyslexia. The discoveries of rather high MZ concordance rates in contrast with the significantly lower DZ concordance rates show the presence of genetic impacts in dyslexia. Maybe the high concordance rate for MZ twins is due to a more powerful tendency to report concordant instead of discordant twin pairs. Maybe twins and their parents have a tendency to be more open to the idea of the twins being hired for a research study if the twins are comparable rather than different. A group of Colorado scientists made an effort to keep away from such a referral and recruitment bias. First of all, they identified all of the twins in grades 3 through 12 in the cooperating school districts in Colorado and chosen those sets in which at least one twin had low reading accomplishment scores. Second, they evaluated the efficiency of both twins through a substantial battery of mental tests in the lab. Using such a sample, researchers reported that the unbiased concordance rate for reading disability was 68% for MZ and 38% for DZ sets. Simply put, even if formally reported samples were biased, the concordance rates acquired in those studies were still in the right ballpark. Taken as a whole, concordance studies of reading handicap show that genes contribute significantly to the development of dyslexia. These research studies, however, don't help us approximate the relative magnitudes of genetic and ecological influences. Another way to estimate the probability that a kid who has relatives with dyslexia will be impacted is to find out how dyslexia is passed on from one generation to the next. What genetic systems underlie the transmittal of dyslexia? If we learn both the means of genetic transference for a given characteristic and the relevant family history, we can forecast the probability that a given child will be impacted. Research on the transmittal of dyslexia has been formed by certain ideas central to the field of genes. The basic scientific premise of genes has not changed much in the 130 years since Gregor Mendel, an Augustinian monk from Bohemia, crossbred pea plants and figured out that living beings carry genetic elements. In modern-day terms, these elements are called genes. Every adult organism has two alleles, instantiations, of its genes for each trait. These two alleles might be the exact same. Example, both code for brown eyes. Or they might be different. That is, one codes for brown eyes and the other codes for blue eyes. When one allele of the gene dominates the other, it is described as dominant, and the other is described as recessive. For instance, the allele of the gene for eye color that produces brown eyes dominates the allele that produces blue eyes. For the dominant trait, example brown eyes, to be uttered, the individual can have either both alleles code for the dominant characteristic or one allele code for the dominant characteristic and the other for the recessive quality, i.e., brown-brown, brown-blue, or blue-brown. For the recessive quality, blue eyes, to be uttered, however, the individual should have both alleles coding for that quality, for example, blue-blue. The concepts of dominant and recessive transference, the passing on of genes from generation to generation, are essential laws of genes. These laws are used to analyze patterns of human inheritance. We don't carry out breeding explores our fellow Homo sapiens the way Mendel did with peas. For one thing, such experiments would take too long. For another, they would be really costly. And most important, they would be unethical. Instead, scientists profit from the experiments human beings carry out willingly in the process of satisfying their sexual instincts. To do so, researchers use ancestral trees, pedigrees. Pedigrees differ in size, complexity, and number of generations. An example would be the following. Some pedigrees from backwoods in Nepal include numerous people, since most of the residents of these villages are related in some way. Other pedigrees, like the pedigree of the Romanovs, a family of Russian czars, go back to the middle 1500s and include representatives of all major royal families of Europe. The pedigree of the average European normally includes 2 or 3 generations and 5 to 8 people. The first pedigree used in a hereditary research study at the start of this century was that of a family from a Norwegian village. This family was of interest because lots of its members had reduced hands and fingers. The pattern of inheritance transmission of this quality was very unique. 1. It never skipped a generation. All short-handed people had either 1 or 2 short-handed parents. 2. A short-handed person who married an individual with hands of typical length had half normal-handed and half short-handed progeny. And 3. Normal kids of a short-handed and normal-handed person who married regular people had regular children. From then on, there was no real short-handedness in that branch of the family. That pattern of gene transference is just what is expected for a dominant mode of inheritance. The dominant allele of the gene identifies which quality will be uttered. On the other hand, the recessive mode of inheritance describes a scenario in which two recessive alleles are needed to express a characteristic. For instance, in illnesses sent recessively, frequently both parents or caretakers have one copy of the defective gene and look absolutely typical. The traditional case of recessive inheritance is albinism. Here is an example. In some Native American populations, one person in 150 is an albino. Example, she or he has no pigment in the eyes, hair, or skin. Most albino children are born to parents or caretakers with normal coloring. According to the recessive mode of transmittal, for this to be the case, each of these parents should have a single allele of the albino gene matched with another typical allele that produces regular coloring. Even so, half the sperm and half the eggs of these parents or caretakers carry the albino gene. Should such sperm and egg meet, the kid will have two alleles of the albino gene and will be an albino. Given that a kid inherits particular genes, what do these genes do in regards to running the biochemical processes of the body? Many biochemical procedures in our bodies, including brain activity, are controlled by proteins, biological products encoded by genes. Moreover, proteins are the foundation of human organisms. The specification and building and construction of proteins is directed by genes, which are sequences of bases, molecular letters, in the double spiral DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, strings situated in a chromosome. The full genome, when and if ever printed out, would take up 200 volumes, each the size of a telephone directory with 1,000 pages. It will probably just be noted on a CD-ROMs. DNA is made up of 4 chemicals: adenine, A, cytosine, C, guanine, G, and thymine, T. The human hereditary makeup consists of 3 billion molecular letters loaded into genes. These molecular letters are organized into words. All words are of the exact same length, and they all include only 3 letters, that is, TAT or AGG. These 3-letter words are guidelines to make amino acids, the bricks with which proteins are built. The movie Gattaca uses the analogy of an user's manual to define the role of molecular letters. The sequences of these letters tell our minds and bodies what to do. Replacing just one letter for another can in some cases mean the difference between health and disease. A person who struggles with hemophilia, for example, is a carrier of such a single-letter spelling error. Not all genes operate at a given moment in time. Many of them are silent much of the time. A gene is turned on by a variety of regulatory particles. Those particles acquire a series of molecular letters at a precisely specified place on a gene and unzip a neighboring stretch of letters, allowing the gene to be translated by specialized molecules of RNA, ribonucleic acid, which, in turn, manage the production of protein. Typically, the regulatory particles are proteins themselves, so the process of an organism's development is a series of stages in which DNA makes proteins, some of which connect with other DNA so other proteins get made, etc. That system, though extremely efficient concerning making certain proteins only when they're needed, is completely based on its own perfection and precision. Even minimal deviations from the planned timing and quantity of some proteins in the course of development can have negative results on the organism. The bottom line here is that a single gene seldom defines some identifiable part of the body or behavioral characteristic. What a single gene does is control the production of a particular protein at the time of specific developmental periods, or start, continue, or end a specific biochemical path that also is affected by a lot of other genes. The whole operation resembles following a very intricate recipe in which the quality, amount, and timing of the mixing of the active ingredients are most importantly essential. The recipe is particularly complicated for the development of the human brain, the most innovative organ of the human organism. Scientists approximate that about 30,000 human genes are associated with the development and maturation of the brain and nervous system. With all of these genes, some organization is needed for them. How are all of these genes organized? The human genome is organized in terms of chromosomes. A chromosome is a long hair of genetic material called DNA, which includes countless genes in a protecting package. Each person has 2 copies of each chromosome, 1 copy from the mom and 1 from the father. There are 23 sets of chromosomes in all human cells other than for sperm and egg cells. Each sperm and each egg receive only 1 copy of each chromosome. 22 chromosome sets equal in male and female organisms. These chromosomes are called autosomes. The 23rd set figures out the sex. Sex chromosomes in males and females are extremely different. Women have 2 big X chromosomes. Males have a single X and a littler Y. Many acquired diseases are carried on the X chromosome. In females, the presence of a faulty gene on one X chromosome can be hidden by a typical gene on the other X chromosome. Males, however, because they have only a single X chromosome, don't have the luxury of hiding their defective gene. For this reason, sex-linked problems are seen more frequently in males than in women. Consequently, when an unequal sex ratio is observed for a particular quality, the first hypothesis is usually that the characteristic is X-linked. Chapter 6. Are there really more males than females with dyslexia? It has prevailed knowledge for a very long time that there are roughly 4 times as lots of boys as girls identified as having dyslexia. Some proof gathered in special education schools and neurological clinics support this claim. In particular, physicians and reading specialists work with more boys than girls. Additionally, researchers have documented a regularly higher sex ratio, 1.7 for every 1 of boys to girls, in the impacted brother or sisters of children with dyslexia. Thus, scientists have investigated the possibility that the root of reading impairments is different for males and females. The first hypothesis was that something in boys' prenatal environments makes them more vulnerable to dyslexia. Here is an example. Researchers observed a predominance of affected males in families with language-impaired mothers. Scientists suggested that dyslexia might be linked to the male hormone testosterone, and that the impacted moms had higher levels of testosterone at the time of conception than did the highly not affected mothers. The significant investigation of the unequal sex ratio, however, unfolded around the hypothesis that there's something about the genetic transference of dyslexia that differs in males and women. To put it simply, scientists suggested that sex impacts the way dyslexia is passed from generation to generation. 4 different types of sex effects on transmittal were proposed. 2 of these hypotheses considered the involvement of one of the sex chromosomes, the X chromosome, and 2 others assumed other impacts of sex. First, scientists suggested that dyslexia may show X-linked inheritance, as do colorblindness and hemophilia. For example, none of the children of a colorblind father and a non-colorblind mom will have colorblindness, but all of the sons and none of the daughters of a colorblind mom and a non-colorblind father will have colorblindness. All males, an unusual X, show its detrimental influences, but in most females, the gene is hidden by a gene for typical vision on the second X chromosome. For this reason, colorblindness is seen more regularly in boys than in girls. Similarly, if the dyslexia gene is on the X chromosome, reading problems should be more common amongst boys than among girls. Moreover, if the gene is X-linked, certainly there should be no or really little transmittal of dyslexia from a daddy with dyslexia to his kids. A second hypothesis suggests that dyslexia is a sex-influenced disorder. An example of this type of disorder is male baldness. That kind of inheritance does not assume that the appropriate gene is situated on the X chromosome. The gene is thought to be among the autosomal, not sex-linked chromosomes. But the gene's specific impact depends upon the sex of the provider due to some other non-genetic, sex-specific natural mechanism. A third hypothesis is that the transmittal of dyslexia is mitochondrial. Mitochondria are the only independent structures in a cell, besides the nucleus, that have their own packs of DNA. When the egg is fertilized, much of its cytoplasm, and that includes the mitochondria, is handed down to the developing embryo. Sperm, though, pass on practically no mitochondria. Therefore, mitochondrial DNA has its own pattern of transmittal. It is given the maternal line. There are many examples of such inheritance, which includes some forms of loss of sight due to damage of the optic nerve. Because the egg and not the sperm brings mitochondrial DNA, mitochondrial transmittal occurs only between moms and progeny. Moms pass the gene on to sons and daughters, but only the daughters pass it on to the next generation. Finally, a fourth hypothesis links a genetic phenomenon called inscribing in the transmittal of dyslexia. Imprinting happens when the results of a certain gene depend on whether it is passed on by the mother or by the father. Imprinted genes, genes that have an effect determined by their origin, can be located on any non-sex chromosome, i.e., any autosome. Each parent seems to stamp the gene personally when it gets sent to her or his offspring. A gene handed down by a mom to her son varies in its impact from the same gene when it is gone by this child to his own children. It appears that the transmitted gene is marked by the sex of the transmitter, and the mark reverses its indication whenever the line of transference changes from one sex to the other. Examples of imprinted diseases are the Prader-Willi/Angelman syndromes, which produce mental retardation. The signs of these disorders are so distinct that initially they are thought to be completely different from one another. Actually, they're triggered by the exact same gene. The distinction lies in whether the mother or the father passed the gene to the child. Kids with an irregular gene from their father develop Prader-Willi syndrome, although the ones who receive the same gene from their mom develop Angelman syndrome. Children with Prader-Willi syndrome are fat, whereas the Angelman kids are of regular weight, but children with both syndromes display mental retardation. In sum, 4 hypotheses attempted to account for the greater observed identification rates of dyslexia in males than in females. Those 4 hypotheses are X-linked inheritance, sex-influence inheritance, mitochondrial inheritance, and imprinted inheritance. To test these 4 hypotheses, researchers inspected the rates and the severity of transmittal for each of the possible combos of parent and kid sex qualities: boy mother, boy father, girl father. There are tons of pairs of affected fathers and sons, so the first hypothesis of X-linked transference was declined. Additionally, the transmittal rates for moms and dads were essentially equal. Thus, the hypothesis of mitochondrial transference did not hold either. Likewise, both the high frequency of the disorder in the general population and the practically equal transference rates for mothers and fathers refuted the imprinting hypothesis. Sex-influenced transference, however, remains a possibility just because of the slight excess of impacted males. Therefore, of the 4 tested hypotheses defined above concerning the transference of dyslexia, only sex-influenced transference fits current information from family research studies. This hypothesis is yet to be confirmed. Current massive research studies of the sex ratio of afflicted people in random samples, instead of individuals selected through clinics, typically show that the percentage of affected boys and girls isn't substantially different from 1 to 1. Example, there are roughly equal varieties of boys and girls amongst kids with dyslexia. Though across multiple samples from different research studies, which include smaller scale studies, the male-female ratio is somewhat higher, 1.5 to 1. 2 kinds of alternative ecological explanations have been suggested for the predominance of boys among children with dyslexia. These clarifications are recommendation predisposition and greater susceptibility of boys to harmful ecological influences. The excess of males in referred and clinic samples of children with reading problems could be because of an ascertainment predisposition. Boys described scientific services might have manifested, in addition to reading problems, behavior troubles that made them more disruptive in the classroom than girls. So many scientists have reported that teachers tend to refer a disproportionate number of boys for issues associated with reading special needs, compared to the ratio of boys and girls with dyslexia determined through the random samples when the evaluation of reading skills is carried out by a psychologist. For instance, in a longitudinal study of Connecticut children in kindergarten through grade 3, many more boys, 13.6%, than girls, 4.2%, were determined by the school system as eligible for unique services. Although according to test-based research criteria, about 9% of boys and 7% of girls were classified as having reading special needs. In a general sense, it has been demonstrated that struggling male students are more likely to be referred for assessment by teachers than are female students with similar abilities and accomplishment levels. According to the second environmental hypothesis, boys might be more afflicted than girls by such ecological impacts as quality of teaching, social class differences, and external social pressures. Hereditary analysis revealed that ecological impacts on reading skills have the tendency to be higher for boys than for girls. Having said that, more precise identification of the environmental elements that relate to the development of reading issues in males will be a tough venture. Despite of the disparities in empirical data with regard to the precise ratio of males to females amongst those with dyslexia, in all studies there seems a somewhat higher rate of dyslexia among males. As we have talked about, 4 hypotheses have been suggested to represent this phenomenon. 1. A choice of predisposition, which results in more boys than girls being referred to services. 2. The presence of certain natural factors in dyslectic parents or caretakers, that is, certain hormones that raise the number of male births in these families. 3. A greater hereditary susceptibility to dyslexia in boys than in girls. And 4. A greater environmental susceptibility to dyslexia in boys. These explanations are not mutually unique, but at this moment, there's insufficient evidence to favor any specific one or combination of them. So, at this time, two essential questions: whether there's indeed an unequal sex ratio, and if so, why, still stay in a dyslexia fog. This has been Dyslexia: Facts About Dyslexia, Dyscalculia, and Dysgraphia by Lee Randolph. Narrated by J.A. Leidig. Dyslexia: Causes, Consequences, and ADHD by Lee Randolph. Narrated by J.A. Leidig. Chapter 1: What you should be looking for. Amongst children who are weak at reading and spelling, those suffering from dyslexia form a unique group. I should like to start by suggesting how one can select the dyslexic child and how he or she differs from the other poor readers and spellers. Perhaps the most helpful starting point is to consider whether one can exclude more uncomplicated explanations of the child's difficulties. Therefore, lots of children are weak at reading and spelling simply because it is challenging for them to deal with intellectual tasks in general. In such cases, the term dyslexia would be entirely unsuitable. What we need to be on the lookout for is a special weakness which shows itself in reading and spelling, or in many cases in spelling only, when in a lot of other aspects the child doesn't behave like a dullard at all. Here is an example. Most dyslectic kids, not all of them, are able to handle arithmetic. A lot of them can learn by heart with no trouble, and most can follow highly complex reasoning, even though they can't put the correct answer on paper. One of the leaders in this area, Hinshelwood, defines the pitiful story of a child who discovered his reading books by heart and hence, for a little time, kept away from detection when he was required to read in front of the class. It's not impossible for a child to be dyslectic and dull, but if he is weak all around, you would have no special reason for presuming the presence of dyslexia. Again, if a child is known to have undergone some specifically undesirable shock, example the death of a caretaker, or to have needed to endure other problems at home, you might find that his performance at reading and spelling suffered, particularly if he was of an age, say under 8, when these skills had not been completely learned. In such a case, though, you would probably find that his schoolwork was impacted as a whole, and that the failure was not limited to reading and spelling. Though it is obviously totally possible for a dyslexic kid to have other concerns in his life, you would have no good reason for thinking dyslexia if the child's failure could be explained in these other terms. The same is true when it comes to a kid's lack from school. A bright child who had been absent may find difficulty with reading and spelling when he later returned to his class, but the apparent clarification of the failure would in this case be the lax. Similarly, if you know that a particular school or a particular class infamously fails in teaching kids to read and spell, and one of your children had recently come from such a class or school, you would most likely be right to associate his failure to poor teaching. You could sometimes meet cases where failure at reading or spelling is because of defective eyesight or hearing. Therefore, even a kid who has had a thorough health check might have lost his glasses or for some reason be unable or unwilling to use them. And it is conceivable that small hearing loss can definitely go undiscovered. Children who have suffered from any of these handicaps clearly warrant attention and compassion. Yet, their most important needs are a lot different from those of the dyslexic kid. If, however, the child's failure has been limited to several particular areas, consisting of reading and spelling in particular, and if this failure cannot be explained along the lines indicated above, if one might say there's something really confusing about the child's failure, something which does not make a lot of sense, then one possibility, to name a few, is that the kid is dyslexic. At this stage, it is worthwhile looking for some of the most positive signs. One of the most crucial of these is confusion over direction. This can take numerous shapes, for example, misreading B for D, or P for Q, or making the corresponding error in writing them. Therefore, one boy whom I taught baffled boys with dogs, and recently I have stumbled upon follig for tulip and catgill for caterpillar. In some cases, the letters of a word are in the wrong order, meaning DNA for AND. You should not, of course, take mistakes of this kind too seriously when they are made by 5 or 6-year-olds. They are very common in the early stages of finding out how to read and write, and the biggest majority of kids grow out of them by the age of 7 or 8 at the latest. If the kid is to be identified as dyslexia, one would need proof of relentless troubles over direction, continuing up to the age of 9, 10, or beyond. And one sometimes finds that despite the fact that the last mark on the paper is the right way around, say B and not D, there has been an enormous expense of effort to attain this. The crossings out in their exercise books repay detailed study. In particular, care is typically needed in trying to discover if the kid has truly made a directional error, as would hold true, for example, if he wrote DNA for AND, an appropriate spelling apart from methodical confusion of the back-to-front variety, or whether he simply didn't know which letter to put next. Thus, it is not clear out of framework whether a child who writes while forthwith is making a back-to-front mistake over the TH, or whether he's simply relying on uncertainty and vague memories. Sometimes, too, there is confusion in the vertical plane, as when it is replaced with Y. But I really have found this to be less common than horizontal confusions, such as BD and PQ. In what follows, I shall describe those errors over the direction of letters and words as reversals. In the more technical literature, you may encounter the word strephosymbolia. This totals up specifically the same thing. It means actual turning of the symbols, and it seems to be a safe or good word. Although not all dyslexic children spell words as oddly as this, these severe examples illustrate in a particularly explanatory way where the main trouble often lies. I would like to emphasize that the boys who produced these spellings all came out above average on basic intelligent tests. The boy who was responsible for sample 4 being right up in the exceptional variety. How, then, can children of undeniable ability write such utter rubbish? The point, as I see it, is that though to us these efforts are nonsense, to the kids themselves they are no more and no less nonsense than most other marks on paper. Undoubtedly, once the complexity of the total shape reaches more than a specific amount, the difference between what's rubbish and what is meaningful doesn't show up for them. From bitter experience, a child may actually expect to be told that some or all of his words are wrongly spelled, but he has no way of telling for himself which of them are wrong or why they are wrong. There is, one is tempted to say, a particular loss of sight at acknowledging those words, not because the child is blind in the regular sense, but because the marks on paper somehow don't stick. An old name for dyslexia was word blindness. which is rather curious term maybe, but still informative. In my opinion, actually, since it implies that in some curious way there is something which the child just cannot see, even though in the normal sense his vision may be flawlessly normal. As a consequence of his handicap, the child is in no position to check what he has written. His only choice is to use such cues as he can, consisting of extraneous ones like the expression on the instructor's face. One apparent gadget is to pay more attention to his own mouth movements when he says the word. The spelling that happens when a child cannot confirm what he has written, I propose to call bizarre spelling. You can take it as strongly established that unusual spelling and reversals typically go hand in hand. A further complication needs reference at this point. It has been my experience that when a dyslexic child begins to overcome his disabilities, his reading begins to enhance earlier than his spelling. Certainly, you may stumble upon kids who, though weak at spelling, can read quite fluently. I think that one would still be validated in calling such kids dyslexic, provided that at an earlier age there had been some evidence both of a reading disability and of the related signs such as confusion over direction. The practical decision in such cases is whether their spelling is adequately weak that it still requires special coaching, or whether the child would be better off if he simply went back to his typical class. To summarize, the dyslexic kid is the same somebody that has special trouble with spelling and typically with reading as well, his efficiency falling short of his intellectual level. Typically, he continues to reverse letters and words at an age when other kids no longer do so, and his spelling is often bizarre. Sometimes there are additional signs discussed in the previous paragraph. Whenever you stumble upon a kid who fits this general picture, you would be very correct to label him as a dyslexic, and to understand that his problems merit unique attention. Chapter 2: Dyslexia and ADHD. ADHD is normally evident from the first day of school, while dyslexia is typically not recognized until 4th or 5th grade, when the shift is made from learning how to read to reading to learn, how to tell the difference and get help. Yet it is clear in kindergarten that he was also dealing with something else. His instructor told us that he could not read the word the, even after repeated exposures to the word. She felt that he was focusing but could not read words at his age level and intellectual capacity. After a full neuropsychological assessment, before beginning 1st grade, it was found that he was also badly dyslexic. About 50 to 60% of those with ADHD also have a learning disability. The most typical of these is dyslexia, a language-based learning disability that affects reading. 8 to 17% of the population is affected by dyslexia and is vastly misinterpreted. Defining dyslexia. Contrary to popular belief, dyslexia is not reading letters or words backward. It manifests itself in different ways in different people. Dyslexics might have difficulty with phonemic awareness, which is the recognition and breaking down of the sounds of letters. A problem in segmenting words is also common to the disorder. A patient of mine called Ryan told me that he used to read the word doctor as do-tor rather than doctor. Rhyming and quick, uncomplicated recognition of sight words, such as the, are also problems. All of these difficulties affect the rate, accuracy, fluency, and understanding of material that reads. Obtaining even easy words can be tough. My patient, Jane, was telling me a story and ended up being annoyed when she spoke of the thing we eat meat with because she could not think of fork. Incorrectly replacing words is pretty common. An example would be the following. One boy with dyslexia said, Hawaii has a ton of twisters instead of volcanoes. The quick naming of letters, objects, colors, and pictures might suffer. Learning the alphabet is harder for dyslectic children. Those difficulties usually coexist with high verbal capabilities. A patient, Jack, scored above the 90th percentile in vocabulary and verbal understanding, yet was in the 5th percentile in reading indices. We tend to expect good speakers to be good readers. This is not the case with dyslexics. Other obstacles include spelling, cursive writing, foreign languages, and any info that relies on rote memory, phone numbers, and so on. Dyslexia runs in families and has a genetic part. So many children with dyslexia have a dyslexic parent. My spouse and I had our own reading difficulties when we were younger. The frequency rate of dyslexia among people with an affected brother or sister is about 50%. Dyslexia is a neurologically based condition, and substantial research has found differences in dyslexic and non-dyslexic brains. Distinctions and similarities. ADHD signs are worsened by dyslexia and vice versa. Both ADHD and dyslexia have some signs in common, such as information processing speed obstacles, working memory deficits, calling speed, and motor abilities deficits. So it is simple for a parent or a professional to mistake dyslexic symptoms for ADHD. "We didn't even suspect my daughter could have dyslexia," said one patient's mother. "We assumed that reading was tough just because of the inattentive signs of ADHD. Now we realize that it was dyslexia that was worsened by the ADHD." Some of one of the most harmful myths about learning disabilities. ADHD symptoms are normally obvious from the first day of school, while dyslexia is usually not completely acknowledged till 4th or 5th grade, when the shift is made from learning how to read to reading to learn. Parents who reveal concern early on are often told by teachers that every student reads differently and they will catch up. Differences and similarities between the two conditions include dyslexic students who haven't been diagnosed with ADHD will display concentration and attention issues, mostly with reading needs, but usually not in other situations. For people with ADHD, attention is low in any unstimulating environment or task. Generally, those detected with dyslexia are better at auditory processing than the ones with ADHD. Those with ADHD and/or dyslexia are at high risk for self-confidence problems. Marcus, a patient of mine, developed a mood disorder and became afraid of school as a result of his extreme dyslexia and ADHD. Chapter 3. Interventions for dyslexia. It is necessary that somebody diagnosed with either ADHD or dyslexia is examined for the other condition. The longer dyslexia goes undetected, the even worse its effect on reading development and self-esteem. Consult a dyslexia specialist to help your kid get the right intervention. Schools are not always equipped to teach a dyslexic student. There are pretty specific reading interventions for dyslexia. Orton Gillingham, Wilson, and Linda Mood Bell, to name just several. Directed reading isn't an intervention for dyslexia. Make sure your child gets an interference that has been empirically verified for dyslexic students, not one developed to help having a hard time non-dyslexic readers. Dealing with ADHD can help overall focus, concentration, and working memory, but it will not cure dyslexia. Parents sometimes fear the label of dyslexia for their kid. They do not really want their kid to feel different. But dyslexic kids do feel different because they are. It's our responsibility to see that the distinction isn't equated with inferiority. Research studies show that when children are detected as having dyslexia versus vague labels like particular learning handicap, their self-confidence is positively impacted. Develop an IPP. Instead of the IEP that is used in school, I developed an IPP, lack of knowledge protection plan, for my child. When he was first identified, I explained to him that some people will incorrectly think he is not smart just because of his dyslexia and may be unkind about it. And there will be other people who will be shocked that he has such an advanced vocabulary. So we came up with a plan to handle those responses. My child and I rehearsed ways he should act and what he ought to say when someone says, "You do not know how to read?" Proud tears welled in my eyes just 1 week later when he got back from school pointing out an interaction with another student who was shocked that he could not read the lyrics to a tune in class. He told her that he had dyslexia, a knowing distinction that Walt Disney and a lot of other successful people had. He said that dyslexia makes reading difficult for him, but that he is smart. There are many gifts that come along with the ADHD dyslexic brain. Having said that, these gifts are fully expressed only when the pitfalls are properly evaluated and dealt with. A research study conducted at Cass Business School in London found that 35% of entrepreneurs were dyslexic. Dyslexics were more likely than non-dyslexics to delegate authority and to excel in oral communication and problem solving. Simply put, dyslexia and success can work together. Chapter 4. The Causes of Dyslexia. The causes of dyslexia aren't all known for sure. Personally, I am in no doubt that where children show the pattern of those impairments, it is right to think concerning something constitutional, something that is connected with the physical constitution of the kid. In particular, it would seem that in some way there are some minor problems in the way in which the brain has created. Beyond this, however, one can't go with any degree of certainty. I have met several cases where there was any history of a mishap extreme enough to imply that the brain has actually been harmed during childhood. Every so often, there are reports of trouble at birth, but these are the exemption rather than the rule. In general, and in as far as one can differentiate the two, it appears to me that one should talk not so much about the damage as about failure of development. Furthermore, since the brain is continually changing in all kinds of ways, it does not follow that such failure will be long-term. Some private investigators have wondered if there is an inherited element at work, and there are definitely cases on record where more than one member of a family has been affected. Exactly what brain systems are included, though, isn't well known for certain, and it might rather well be that dyslexia results when there is a mix of negative factors. It may even be that the causes are different in different cases. If kids or parents have a garbled idea of what's going on, for example, my last teacher said there was something queer about my brain, you will be doing a kind act if you put them right. The sort of thing which I have sometimes said to parents is, he is flawlessly all right in other respects, but there is just some little failure of brain development, and this makes it challenging for him to identify shapes and letters. The brain abnormalities, if they exist, are naturally very alike, and one should always keep in mind the enormous number of things which dyslectic kids can do flawlessly well. For practical purposes, it doesn't appear to me that an understanding of the details of what causes dyslexia is needed. What I believe to be crucial, though perhaps not all educational psychologists would agree with me, is the recognition that dyslexia is a unique variety of the condition understood in health books as aphasia. That is a condition in which some cases happens in adults as a result of brain injury, and the influence of it is that they at times be puzzled in their speech and thinking. Here is an example. A patient is presented with 2 sticks, V, and is required to copy them. he cannot really do so. When presented with a much different pattern, the same V sign but upside down though, he can copy them with no difficulty. When asked how this is so, he says that the second pattern is a roof, while the first is absolutely nothing. In some cases, adult aphasic patients can read few familiar words but can't handle unknown material. And when a specific area of the brain is damaged, the frontoparietal area, although they might be able to find their way about their home or their health center, they might have difficulty in representing home or medical facility if required to make a strategy drawing. In general terms, there is quite often a difficulty in coping with symbolic or abstract material, in particular with putting the parts in the right order. The analogy of aphasia appears to me appropriate for the following important reasons. One can say, subsequently, that the dyslexic child's handicap is no one's fault, neither that of the parent for being incompetent, unloving, overprotective, neurotic, etc., nor that of the instructor for failing to teach appropriately. One can appreciate that the child is disabled, just as, for instance, a lame child is disabled, even if the handicap in this case is less incredible and clear. Someone can learn to understand the mistakes which these kids make by comparing these errors with those made by aphasic adults. Hence, one would expect all dyslexic children to be able to recognize, say, a picture of an elephant, since little by way of abstraction is involved. But one would expect a lot of them to have trouble over making or interpreting the symbolic marks on paper which constitute the written word elephant. And one would expect several of them to have difficulty in repeating longer words, since this involves putting the symbols in the right order. Where there is actually something which the kid absolutely cannot really do, example, acknowledge words at sight, it seems to me more reasonable to offer him a way around his disability than to press him to keep attempting, since the brain systems necessary for success by that specific technique may simply not be there. It is, of course, quite possible that such systems may develop few years later, and this possibility ought to definitely be taken a look at in the case of older children, where there is a history of earlier failure. But in a general sense, my experience is that motivating the kid in what he can do is better than prompting him to practice those things which he cannot do. I personally think that all the ones who have thoroughly studied the mistakes made by dyslexic children would agree that the analogy with aphasia is worth taking seriously. To summarize, it seems to me that one is right to think of dyslexia as a variety of aphasia, that is, an inability to handle and order symbolic or abstract material. The causes aren't known in detail, but the condition is likely connected to some small failure of development in the brain. Chapter 5. Teaching Reading, down to specifics. Before we present the particular methods examined by researchers in their intervention studies, we introduce two general principles for reading guideline. First of all, kids benefit most from reading direction that's specific, methodical, and sequential. Second, as is how it is for all teaching, reading direction is most effective if it is active and engaging and based upon discovery and understanding, even as it allows room for practice and exercise. Though some would say that these different components are alternatives and show the really contradiction between different contemporary leading approaches to teaching reading, we believe that reliable reading instruction needs to include these multiple elements. An example of the value of systemized self-practice originates from a study performed by Barbara Wise and Richard Olson. Those scientists chose a group of 2nd through 5th graders who scored in the lowest 10% of their classes on a test of single word recognition. These children were trained in half-hour sessions over a term for a total of 25 hours during their regular reading periods. The children were asked to read interesting stories on the computer system. The stories were chosen to match or to be partially ahead of a given kid's reading level. The children were told to pick with the computer system mouse any challenging words they came across. A computer-synthesized voice would then read the word to guarantee the precision of the kid's reading. That organized reading practice brought substantial gains on some procedures of word recognition. This study allows us to draw two conclusions. First, systemized and accurate reading is really beneficial to poor readers. Second, the amount of direction and precise reading these kids received at the time of the training periods was considerably greater than the majority of these readers would have gotten in their routine classes. Having said that, when scientists went back to the same group of children 2 years after the end of training, they found that the students' word recognition had returned to the slow rate experienced before training. The lesson here is that the training of reading precision ought to be structured, constant, and most importantly, sustained. The value of direct reading guidelines was also shown by Rebecca Felton in her longitudinal study of poor readers. Felton followed a group of poor readers from the 3rd to the 8th grade. The students were assessed at the start and end of the research study and in the 5th grade. When Felton compared reading improvements with time, she discovered that poor readers made more gains in all elements of reading from the 3rd to 5th grades than from the 5th to 8th grades. Simply put, poor readers earned less progress in intermediate school than in elementary school. Felton attributed this difference to the decline in direct reading instruction that students experience when they progress from primary to intermediate school. Generally, most teaching around the globe accentuates memory and, to a lesser level, analytical reasoning, which mostly benefits students with a memory-oriented or analytically oriented profile of abilities. In our work, we have revealed that everything, even reading, can be taught triarchally, in a manner in which addresses all 3 types of abilities: analytical, creative, and useful. Our research discoveries demonstrate that as a group, children taught triarchally to think analytically, creatively, and virtually while learning outperform kids taught only for memory or only for analytical thinking. This remarkable performance is seen not only on specialized tasks, example those that are creative and useful, but also on conventional analytical activities and even on multiple choice memory tests, at which one would expect the more typically instructed kids to stand out. In its summary research statement, the NICHD examined leading interference research studies in the field of particular reading disability and proposed 6 major concepts for early reading instruction. Notice that these principles, talked about in the following numbered areas, carefully match a definition of dyslexia we presented earlier. Underlying these principles is the idea that guideline should be targeted at reading, given that the other cognitive abilities of the child are in accordance with typical development. Instruction must be focused on the improvement of phonological, for instance, the phonemic awareness and phonological memory, and decoding abilities, which have been shown to be central to the improvement of single-word reading. Reading guideline is also supposed to deal with spelling abilities, as poor spelling is assumed to be closely linked to the development of reading issues. In the following pages, we will use examples from clinical research to explain and illustrate fundamental principles. 1. We really need to teach phonemic awareness directly, beginning in kindergarten. As noted earlier, phonemic awareness is the capability to recognize and evaluate the individual sounds, called phonemes, in words. Children who have the ability to recognize and determine individual sounds in words are phonemically mindful. It is essential to remember that phonemic consciousness and phonics are different concepts. Phonemic awareness refers to the mastery of the skill of evaluating the individual speech components within a word. Usually, children get a great degree of consciousness of the noises within words, for example rhymes, before acquiring any knowledge concerning specific sound letter or sound spelling correspondence. Phonics is about this correspondence, the depiction of noises with letters. For the majority of typical readers, phonemic consciousness and also other phonological skills, for instance phonological memory, further develop as a repercussion of learning how to read. Some of these abilities develop in typical readers even when these children are not given specific instruction in this area. In other words, regular readers be adept at examining the noises within words and comprehending the relationship between letters and sounds as they learn to see the words in print. However, without direct instruction in phonemic awareness, a lot of readers with dyslexia fail to develop such understanding although they learn to recognize some individual words. Therefore, these poor readers can't gain from the alphabetic system of English and are forced to count on other cues for reading memory of how words look, images, clues from the meaning of the story, etc. Though all these cues contribute in reading, to be a skilled reader in English requires understanding that words are made up of individual noises and that these sounds are represented by letters or strings of letters. Phonemic awareness can be developed through a range of activities in which the student actively engages in examining the sounds of words, rhyming games, tunes and poetry, classifying words based upon noises. Research has unquestionably developed the significance of phonemic awareness to the proficiency of reading through three major pieces of evidence. First and foremost, kindergarten and first grade kids who were behind in mastering phonemic awareness were found to be at risk for having issues learning to read. Second, the phonemic consciousness of older children and adults who are poor readers is unrestricted, apparently. Third, teaching strategies aimed at fostering phonemic consciousness have been found to be an important part of successful training programs. All students really need a firm structure of phonemic consciousness prior to receiving official direction in reading. Because of that, kindergarten programs should include well-organized and thoroughly sequenced phonemic awareness direction for all students. Some students, which include those at risk for difficulty learning to read, will require additional arranged training in phonemic consciousness to prepare them for reading and spelling guidelines. Additionally, when reading and spelling training begins, training in phonemic consciousness should not stop. Many intervention studies have shown that teaching phonemic consciousness and sound spelling relationships all at once accelerates the development of reading skills. For older, poor readers, assessment needs to include evaluation of phonemic awareness skills, and training programs should also include skills that haven't been mastered. The following box offers examples of tasks that could be used to evaluate phonemic awareness. Most kids in kindergarten or higher grades are developmentally ready to receive phonemic awareness direction. Additionally, direct phonemic awareness direction seems to be the most powerful tool to help those kids who fall behind. While not giving direct phonemic awareness intervention to these children puts them in danger for falling further and further behind, giving them this instruction, though, doesn't magically transform them into typical readers. Scientists have suggested that although the incorporation of phonological skills into higher-level reading operations is automatic for typical readers, children with dyslexia have difficulty integrating their mastered phonological abilities and turning them into automated parts of higher-order reading. In this context, it is important to really appreciate the observation made by many researchers. Child development specialists, and educators that all children need some level of guideline to master reading skills. Reading skills don't develop naturally. Practically no child will read if he or she isn't taught how. 2. We really need to teach sound spelling correspondence clearly. Thus far, the primary conclusion to be drawn from intervention studies is that specific, direct guideline, including but not limited to matching of noises with matching letters or sounds with matching letter combinations, is more advantageous than asking a child to obtain the noises for the letters by giving clues. Researchers have found evidence that a lot of children have trouble recognizing the individual sound spelling correspondences if they hear them only embedded in words or word parts. Students should be taught to read and spell words by utilizing the letter-sound associations they have been taught. Specific phonemic direction begins with bringing the student's attention to a speech sound, phenome, in isolation and might include info about how the sound is produced. After that, the letter or mix of letters that represents that sound in English is taught straight. Here is an example. To introduce a new phenome, the teacher would produce the sound and ask the kids to make the sound, emphasizing the correct pronunciation. The instructor also might lead students in a discovery of the phenome in different positions within words, first sound, last sound. The instructor would then show the children the letter used to represent the sound that had been introduced. Starting readers should practice new phenomes and those already learned by using them to read and spell words. 3. We really need to teach the most frequent and highly regular sound spelling relationships directly and methodically. English has about 70 highly frequent sound spelling pairs. Research has revealed that if these sets are taught systematically, the advantage for reading is significant. Systematic teaching means that direction in sound spelling correspondences is closely connected to the material kids are given to read and spell. The closer the match between the two components, the sound spelling correspondence and the reading and spelling material, the higher the possibility of an effective outcome. Methodical also means presenting letter-sound associations in a sensible order, starting with the most routine and continuing to the more irregular. So many teachers are both attentive to details and creative when designing their class lessons. As one elementary school instructor pointed out, if the first sound spelling relationships introduced to kids were A, B, and C, then the only two real words the children could read would be ba and taxi. If, though, the first sound spelling relationships are introduced by the letters A, C, E, and R, the variety of words readily available to the children is larger. Arc, R, vehicle, back, race, period, acre, ace, care, and so on. 4. We really need to teach kids how to sound out words. The mastery of as few as 2 or 3 sound spelling correspondences should be followed immediately by teaching kids how to blend noises into words. Kids should be taught how to move sequentially through the words from left to right to sound out the word. The training ought to correspond in that only those sound spelling relationships that have been mastered should be used in these exercises. For instance, the word sun includes 3 sounds, S, U, and N. The instructor ought to help the child recognize this by asking her or him to divide the word into sounds and to pronounce the word sound by sound. 5. Students should practice the learned sound spelling relationships using linked, decodable text. Nothing is completely free, including but not limited to reading. The results of much intervention research highlight how important it is for children to practice applying their knowledge of sound spelling relationships to the job of reading. Only decodable text, that is, text that matches the level of sound spelling correspondence mastered by students, should be used for teaching students who are developing their skills in using spelling sound associations to read unknown words. This is true both for beginning readers and for the ones who couldn't develop these abilities and who require removal. The higher the level of proficiency of sound-letter relationships, the more sophisticated in suggesting the decodable text should be. Though the initial level of decodable text should be extremely low, so that students can have the chance to practice their newly acquired abilities. Following is an example of sentences from a decodable story used after students have been taught the noises for a set of consonants, short vowels, and the E spelling of the long E sound. See the seed, plant it deep, feel the sun. Less decodable texts require kids to use prediction or framework to read words that they have not yet been taught to decipher or that aren't yet in their sight vocabulary. Whereas much evidence supports the value of forecast abilities in reading to figure out meaning, such as forecasting the next event or outcome. This strategy is not really considered beneficial in word recognition. To understand the difficulty introduced by the forecast strategy, consider the following sample of Jack London's writing. A regular 6th grade reader was able to decipher roughly 80% of this text. The passage demonstrates how the 6th grader sounded out the text. The rushed slots represent the parts of the words that the kid was unable to decipher properly. Now, make use of your own personal experience to consider how simple it would be for you to understand this piece. He had never seen dogs battle as these wish CRTS, and his first ext him an unfallible LN. It is very true, it was VX, else he wouldn't have lived to per it by it. Curly was the V. They were camped near the log store where she, in her friend way, made advertisement to a husky pet dog the size of a full wood. TH not having so big as he. Was no W-ing, only a leap in like a flash. A met clip of teeth. A lep out equal, swift, and Curly's face was tore open from eye to jaw. He has never seen dogs fight as these wolfish beings, and his first experience taught him an unforgettable lesson. It is actually true. It was a vibrant experience. Else, he would not have lived to profit by it. Curly was the victim. They were camped near the log store, where she, in her unfriendly way, made advance to a husky dog the size of a mature wolf, though not half so big as she. There was no caution, only a leap in like a flash, a metal clip of teeth, a leap out equally quick, and Curly's face was tore open from eye to jaw. No doubt, some of the unidentified words in this passage could be determined using setting or a prediction strategy. Though, simply making the right prediction without decoding does not move to real reading. Children can practice most efficiently when they're provided with decodable text early in instruction and until they have mastered a basic set of translating abilities. Then, predictable text can be used to encourage reading further and to allow students to augment their reading-related self-efficacy. We stress the importance of teaching and practicing deciphering skills because poor word recognition is the major hallmark of a person with a reading disability. To compensate for their minimal recognition abilities, poor readers tend to rely more on context and to use guessing and prediction strategies. So many researchers have noted that poor decoding skills in grade school are highly predictive of minimal comprehension and inaccurate and slow reading in later grades. Direct direction in decoding along with practice using decodable text is a very critical component of remedial programs for students with reading impairments. 6. To develop language comprehension, teachers should use intriguing and society and age-appropriate stories. It would be wrong to conclude that everything we have said so far rules out the application of fascinating and engaging genuine stories in the teaching of reading. What is ruled out unquestionably, however, is the application of these stories as reading material for students with exceptionally restricted word identification skills. Whether they're non-readers in grade 1 or really poor readers in grade 5. As discussed, in the early stages of reading, the usage of texts that are controlled for both decodability and vocabulary is crucial. Nonetheless, more complicated texts that build motivation and passion for reading, should be read aloud by the instructor. Use materials that will build students' oral language understanding, which is closely linked to reading understanding. It is very important to recall, though, to see text with story-based materials as what they really are, the enhancers of comprehension, rather than automobiles for teaching decoding abilities. For reading direction to be effective, it is vital that both comprehension and decoding skills described in areas 1 through 5 be taught directly. Good readers read words precisely, using a variety of word analysis abilities, including but not limited to the reliable use of spelling sound associations, and utilize a variety of methods to figure out the meaning of words and text. Direction for young readers and older poor readers should include a balance of methods created to build both word identification and comprehension skills. Research shows that teaching each of these parts directly and methodically is the most efficient instructional practice. According to the very first position, the developmental lag method, teaching ought to be targeted at students performing at the mean of the class, and those that fall right below this mean needs to not be helped or pushed, but rather given time to catch up naturally. Institutionally, this position is shown in educational policies that suggest retention without intervention. These are wait and see or wait for failure practices. According to the other position, the cognitive procedures of children with reading difficulties do not, as the developing lag hypothesis supposes, just develop at a slower rate through the exact same sequence experienced by typical readers. Rather, badly impaired readers are characterized by a deficit. Example, the lack of a component of a process or an entire process or some failure to meet the developmental requirement. And, therefore, they fail to develop proper reading skills. Rather than gradually overtaking their peers who do not have dyslexia, most such students fall further and farther behind. Certain longitudinal studies have shown that 70 to 80% of children who are poor readers in 3rd grade stay poor readers in 9th grade. Scientists supporting this position reason that special measures should be undertaken to evaluate pre-reading kids for the possibility of a future deficit, and preventive removal needs to begin just before the formation of the deficit. The details unquestionably support the second position. Empirical studies of children that have dyslexia do not show that reading impairment arises from developing lag. On the contrary, much evidence supports the deficit model by showing that shortages in phonological processing form challenges to the development of reading and spelling. Because of that, it is clear when we really need to intervene. We cannot wait. We really need to build programs for the main grades that accelerate the phonological development of future normal readers and prevent the formation of the deficit in those kids who are in danger for dyslexia. These discoveries have some ramifications for parents or caretakers. First, it is clear that early recognition and treatment of students in danger for having issues in reading provides the best chance for success. Children whose families have a history of reading problems should be thoroughly evaluated in kindergarten to determine whether risk aspects, such as poor development of phonemic awareness skills or failure to learn letter sound associations, exist. If risk factors are present, interventions should start instantly. While some parents may worry about labeling their child as having a reading impairment by recording and dealing with the issue early, the alternative of waiting to see if a problem develops is far too dangerous. It is also very important that the academic treatment be appropriate for the student and in line with the principles defined here. This has been Dyslexia: Causes, Consequences, and ADHD by Lee Randolph. Narrated by J.A. Leidig.